G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 3 of my ultimate character building series, and in this video we're going to kick off the sculpting phase of the character creation process by creating the head and the hair. So we're going to get that completely done so we can move on to the body in the next video. Alright, so there's a few things I want to talk about before we get started, namely what you need for this to get anything done. Basically, you're gonna need a drawing tablet. Okay, there's no ifs, buts, or maybes about this. Mouse and keyboard, yeah, nah, ain't gonna happen. So highly recommend that if you have a tablet, if you already have one on hand, grab it from the shelf, plug it into your bloody computer, because it's gonna be an absolute lifesaver. If you don't have one already, you can invest in one. They come up pretty cheap these days online. You can get some for as little as 35 bucks. They're pretty basic, but they do the job and they do them well as well. So luckily for you, and luckily courtesy of XP Pen, they have given me a few affiliate links for you to check out, along with some discount codes, 5% off across their entire range. Go ahead, check them out, and get yourself a tablet. All right, before we move on, have fun with this process. Don't get too frustrated, because it is something that takes practice to get used to. You do have to sort of learn your skill set here. It's like drawing. You kind of have to practice to get it better and better over time. So don't get angry, don't get frustrated, enjoy the process, have fun with it, all right? And of course, finally, if you want to get the source files and some additional content, so I'm going to actually supply some uncut footage along the way on Patreon. So if you want to download those along with the source files, sign up to Patreon, $3, even if it's just for a month. Go ahead and do that and download all the source files you can possibly get. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so to get started, what we're going to need to do is take our neck, ears, and face and join them together as one mesh using Control J. After that, we're going to use the remesh modifier and bring the voxel scale down so that the relative volumes of the different joined meshes are maintained, but not so dense that it bogs down your computer to a crawl. So the values that are used here are highly dependent on the size of the object relative to world space, and that does include scale transforms. So make sure that all transforms are applied before using this modifier. Then once you're happy with the density that you see here, then you can go ahead and apply that modifier, because we're going to need to have that actual geometry for sculpting. Now with that done, we can actually click on that object, and then we can jump into sculpt mode and do a very gentle smoothing pass using the smooth brush across the entire face. This just gets rid of any jagged pieces that you get from the result of the remesh. Now, as you can see here, I like to have two windows open, or two viewports open. That allows me to look at both the front and the side views simultaneously, and also allows me to preview a sculpt without any distraction while I work on the other viewport. I also like to change up the visualization of one of the viewports to give me a different perspective, so to speak, on how the sculpt is progressing. So on the left side, for instance, I have a matte cap, and on the right side, I just have standard shading with randomized colors per object turned on. Now, I'm not going to need that in a few seconds, because I'm going to hide away some of those geometries that I'm not going to use in this video. But if you're using multiple objects or looking at multiple objects at any given point, it does help sometimes to get a clear visual on which objects you're working on and which parts you aren't. Okay, so to start off, I'm going to be using the Elastic Deform brush with symmetry turned on, X symmetry, and I'm just going to try and line up the important silhouette elements of the face relative to my sketch, relative to my line art that I made in the first video. Now, the Elastic Deform brush is perfect for these moments where you need to make broad changes to the blocking pass of your face. Now, I actually use this throughout the sculpting process, but it is especially useful at this stage. It is worth mentioning as well that at this point, we don't want to get into a lot of detail just yet. We are really working out the general proportions again, and working out the overall structures that will be the foundation for those details in the future. And already it just shows just how important it is to have a very solid line art sketch to work with when making these characters. When you have a very well lined up front and side view, you can figure out where certain elements need to sit. So for instance here, I know that the jawline is fairly sharp on this character, But having the side view also allows me to know where that jaw is meant to sort of curve up into the ear. So I can pull that jaw back. It also gives me an impression of where the eye sockets are going to sit within the face of this character. And you will see that I tend to do a blocking, then I'll smooth it out. Maybe I'll do a mistake and I'll bring it back down to basics, or I'll just refine what I already have. So don't be afraid to redo things a few times over if you're not happy with the result. So, for instance, you can see here that I'm constantly having to bring back the silhouette of the nose and the forehead as I start to sculpt and smooth, because as you smooth things out, things tend to flatten out and you lose volume. So, you need to be aware of that as you sculpt, as you add these details, because there is a habit or there is a tendency for you to stray from the reference if you're not paying attention to it. So every now and then, don't be afraid to take a quick little break, take a pause, and then just see how your model is lining up relative to your reference drawing. It might be an obvious thing to say, but the closer you adhere to your reference image, the closer the 3D sculpt is going to look like that reference image. Okay, so to kick off the primary details of this character, I'm going to add a little bit more volume around the nose. And then I'm going to progress by removing some of that volume where I need to fill out the eye sockets and where I want the brow line to sit. So I'm just using the clay strips tool for this. Now, if you want to add stuff, you just draw as you see fit. If you want to remove stuff, you can hold down the control button and that will do the opposite. It will pull things away, scrape things away for you. And then I combine that with the smooth brush tool. And then, of course, I sometimes go ahead and use the pinch or crease tool to further sharpen up those details a little bit if I think I need them at this time. Also, be mindful that because you're working in 3D, you need to consider the volumes from all angles, top, bottom, side, left, right, up, down, whatever you want to see. And that is especially so if you plan on using this character for animation, because you need to have a character that looks appealing from every conceivable angle. So depending on the character that you're working on, especially if you're going for a more realistic, even if it's stylized realism approach, one of the things you need to be aware of is that the eye sockets sit further into the skull than you think. So you want to build out that volume both in a negative sense and a positive sense, because the last thing you want to have is a character that looks a little bit bug-eyed. Unless, of course, that's what you're going for. All right. So we've got the blocking phase done for the sculpt, and it's already starting to look pretty good. We got some well-defined features coming through in the design that are matching our sketch, okay? So we have our jawline, we have the position of our nose and the eyes, and we have a general layout for the lips. That's looking great so far. So now it's just about adding more iterative detail on top of that, and also making sure that we maintain that silhouette along with making sure that we're not adding too much detail too quickly. So we want to do this in an iterative fashion. So let's go ahead and continue on with the sculpt, and I will note a few things along the way that will help you be conscious of when to push or pull certain features of the face and why it's important. All right, let's continue. Now you can see here that I'm starting to run out of geometry to play with. The detail isn't coming through because I just don't have enough to work with. So there's two ways I can go about increasing the geometry. One is to do a second remesh with a higher density. The other option is to use the dynamic topology feature inside of Blender. I bring the pixel density down in the dynamic topology to around 6 pixels at first, and then I bring it up or down as I need to. So one of the most common issues I find with people who sculpt mouths for the first time is that they tend to make fish lips by accident. Now, that is not because of the way that they're creating the lips themselves. They have to create lips after all. It's because they forget to add the volume in the right way. So one thing you have to remember about lips is that they don't sit flat across the entire span of the lips. The corners of the lips actually sit further back into the face, into the cheek. So just by taking those corners of the lips and pushing them back just a little bit will give it so much more volume and a better feel when it comes to sculpting out that mouth structure. Now, of course, you still have to remember to keep that structure working relative to your reference image. So you can see here, I'm pulling that back forward a little bit still, but I still have that curvature around the lips, around the structure, so I get that nice feel. Now, of course, now just remember, you're probably not going to hit that perfect shape on your first go. So don't be afraid to try it a few times before you get the right look that you want for your character. Another advantage of pushing those corners of the lips back into the skull a little bit is that you get a natural cheek line just by doing that. So you get this nice little bit of volume around the edges of the lips that are conducive to how lips are actually structured and how the mouth is actually structured in real life. So use that to your advantage when you start to formulate the structure of the cheek. Before I jump into talking about the nose and the cheeks, though, I just want to point out that if you are using dynamic topology and you are starting to feel the computer chug a little bit, you can always turn off dynamic topology temporarily as you're working through your model. Or you can do a fresh remesh and bring that detail down a little bit and then work with that instead. Okay, so back onto the cheeks and the nose. So the cheeks are a little tricky depending on the kind of character you're going with. So if you're going for a relatively youthful character, there is a tendency to keep the cheeks quite voluminous and not so bony. If you're going for something that looks a little bit more mature, you want to get that fat reduced around the cheek area, and that will give it a natural aged effect, so to speak, or a more mature effect. This can be quite difficult if you're trying to strike a balance between youthfulness and a sharpness in your character design. So in this case, this character has quite a sharp jawline, but is a youthful character. So we don't want to have the cheeks be too hollow, but we also don't want to lose the volume or the structure of her jawline. So we're trying to strike a balance there. So there's a bit of give and take as I sculpt through this character. Sculpting the nose is pretty straightforward. You just have to sort of push in some structures to get the nostrils in there. Just be aware that nostrils aren't circular. Do not do circular nostrils, then it will look like a cartoon pig. All right. So don't do that. Follow the natural structure of a nose. Use reference where you can. And there's nothing wrong to having photo references next to your sketch references as well. So everything is useful in this regard. I just want to emphasize that this is purely a stylistic choice. You do not have to put these details into your character if you do not want to. Now, I say that because there is a tendency for one to maybe lean a little bit further into realism or fall into the trap of thinking that adding more detail on top of your initial design is going to lead to a better result. So, a good example of this is the nose and the ears. So, if your sketch doesn't really have details such as nostrils or realistic ears, then don't be tempted into adding those details into your sculpt just because you think that they should have them in 3D. Now, I will be adding them into my sculpt purely for the sake of you guys to look at as reference to learn from that. But if I were to do it my own way, I probably wouldn't have added them into this character if I was going to go down a more stylized approach. Now we're coming up to probably one of the more difficult parts of the sculpting process, in my opinion, and that is sculpting out the eyes. Now, the reason I say the eyes are probably the most difficult to work with is because you're dealing with very complex volumes. So you're dealing with the volume of where the eye is sitting within the head, but you're also dealing with the way it sits around the entire structure of the face. You want to keep the design of your eyes consistent with your drawing, but you also have to have it fit within the volumes of the character design in 3D as well. So that can be quite tricky to do. So start off in very broad strokes and then push and pull geometries as you see fit. And make sure that you do at this stage create a proxy eyeball. So this is pretty straightforward. Create an icosphere and then create a mirror modifier. And then in edit mode, scale down that icosphere to fit within the structure of your face. Now, for all intents and purposes, this is pretty much going to be an approximation at this stage because you are going to probably move this thing around as you continue to sculpt out the character. The first attempt of placing the eyeball isn't going to look very good, as you can see here. We're going to have to push and pull some of the structures of our sculpt to make the eyelids sit around that sphere. Additionally, it's more likely than not that your initial lineup is going to look very, very weird and very, very alien like. So don't be discouraged if you first pull these structures around and you're just like, what the hell has happened to my sculpt? It's okay. It just takes time to refine the sculpt to fit around your reference and within the structures of that eyeball. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't really talked about tools that much in a little while, and that's because the tools that I'm using haven't changed all that much. I'm still using pretty much the same ones. I'm using the elastic deform I'm using the clay strips tool, and then I'm using the pinch and crease tool pretty much exclusively throughout this process. And then every now and then, I'm going to have dynamic topology turned on or off given the needs of the sculpt. Right now, I have it turned on, so it allows me to create some extra volumes for those eyelids. But pay attention to just how I'm operating within Blender. For the most part, I almost always have the reference image visible at some stage of the sculpting process. Whether I'm using the viewport on the left or right when I'm sculpting doesn't really matter. The point is that at least one of those viewports will have the drawing, the reference drawing, available for me to look at a glanceable notice. Now, this is especially important at this stage of the sculpt where I'm trying to get the perfect eye shape, the shape that I really liked about my character design overall from the sketching phase was the shape of the eyes. And I really wanted to make sure I could capture that. Now, that of course is quite tricky given the angularity of the eyelids and, well, I guess you can say the opposite nature of the eyeball, which is circular or spherical. It's really hard to maintain those sharp values around the structure of the eyeball. So it does have a little bit of give and take. It does require me to sort of push and pull and sort of walk away and come back to the sculpt every now and then to see how things are looking after maybe a day or so of just not looking at it. Now, this is also a good thing to point out is that if you're just not having a good time trying to get those shapes working with the eyeball, it's more likely than not that you need to probably change the scale of the eyeball itself or change the position of the eyeball. So you may need to bring the eyeballs closer together. You may need to scale them down, and that will give you a little bit more space to add those volumes that you need for the character. So, for instance, in this case, I felt that the eyelids were pushing too far back around the eyeball on the outer edge of the eye. So, scaling those eyeballs down allowed me to sort of get that structure to feel a little bit more natural. So, yeah, you will find yourself probably push and pulling the overall scale of the eye as well. So, one other thing you most likely will experience when you are creating the eye is that the eye is sitting too far forward into the face. You will find yourself pushing that eyeball back a little bit. So, as you do that, don't forget to bring back volume in the cheek. Otherwise, the character is going to look very hollowed out. So, you want to bring back that cheek volume underneath the eyelid on the bottom eyelid. And as a result of that, if you're going with a more youthful character, you'll probably have to bring back a little bit more volume into the middle of the cheek as well. Also, one more thing to note about eyelids is that they do have thickness. They do not sit flush with the eyeball. So you want to make sure that there's a little bit of overhang on the top and the bottom of the eyelid. Otherwise, it's going to look really unnatural. And furthermore, it's going to be an absolute pain in the ass to rig. So you want to have a little bit of volume so you can actually get that character blinking properly. Okay, so with the overall structure of the eye pretty much done, I'm going to do a quick time skip to get to the final result here. Now, you might get a little bit annoyed about this, but I will assure you that you're not missing much. It's just me moving and tweaking and softening and smoothing and doing all the same stuff over and over and over again until I get to somewhere that I like. And it's going to be the same process with you. Now, what I will say is that the tools pretty much haven't changed throughout this process that I'm going to be skipping. It's using the elastic deform, it's using the clay strips tool, it's using the crease tool, the pinch tool, and the scrape tool. And I'm also looking to make sure that the model stays true to the reference sketch as I go along. All right, a quick note about eyelids. So eyelids can be quite tricky as well. Just make sure that you're adhering one to your sketch, but you have to be aware of the fleshiness or the sort of volume that you want for the eyelids. Sometimes you don't want any eyelids at all. Sometimes you want to have a bit of overhang from the brow, covering the eyelid a little bit. Sometimes you just want to have a little crease. So again, just using the very basic set of tools, crease brush, the draw sharp brush, and then just pulling and smoothing as you see fit. So in order to get that right volume, just make sure you have a little bit of patience about that and just push and pull as you go along. Then what I like to do as well is use the scrape tool to sort of flatten out certain elements. So if I want to go with a more stylized approach for the eyelid, I like to scrape and sharpen that line up a little bit. I find that to be really useful. So the scrape brush is awesome for that. So you will find as you get to this more refined stage of the sculpt that a lot of the broad stroke stuff tends to come back. So reworking some proportions a little bit, adding new volumes to the skull is a big one for me. I find that as I'm sculpting out the brow line, I tend to lose volume around the skull, so I add more volume back there. And one of the other big parts, again, as I mentioned before, is the cheeks, the volumes of the cheeks and around the jawline. I tend to fix those up a little bit more as well, but they're all relatively minor overall. It's just about adding the volumes in a way that maintains the appeal of the character or enhances the appeal of the character to a certain degree. Sometimes you lose that volume as you're sculpting parts. Sometimes you find that as you are sculpting that you need to pull away some detail. And sometimes you accidentally make a character look too young or too old, so you need to pull back or add more sort of age related detail as needed. One big thing for this character for me was making sure the angularity of the front and side profile of this character was maintained right to the end of this sculpt. Now, sometimes it gets to a point where you're just not sure whether or not you've got enough detail or that the sort of appeal is really there. Now, sometimes the way you can fix that, or at least you can sort of analyze that, is through lighting by actually seeing the character in a rendered environment. So, what we're going to do is create a very simple material. We're going to add a light or two to give us some indication of how light is bouncing off those details. And then we're going to use that to help us enhance our character model. The great thing about this is that it will allow us to see where the uneven parts are, especially around the cheeks and the skull and the eyelids, and sort of smooth those out and making sure that it's nice and even when it comes to the overall structure and design of the face. Now, of course, if you want to have bumps and bruises all over your character, you don't really need to do this. But because we have such a smooth looking character with this design, I figured it doesn't hurt to give it a go. Okay, so what we're going to do is select our character, select our face, and we're going to create a brand new material. So, firstly, we want to turn on Eevee on the material preview. So, we have Eevee turned on here. Um, And if you don't have a light set up in your scene yet, that's okay. Go ahead and create a light. It doesn't take much to do that. I think I already created one in this case. Very basic light. And what we're going to do is create a material to make this work. Now, in this case, I've already got a material from the last video. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. I don't need that. So let's go ahead and remove that material. I'm going to add a brand new one, a new empty principled shader. Now, because I'm using a Mac, it does take some time to load in material sometimes. So there it is. Let's go ahead and now check out this material. So what we're going to do is bring up the subsurface a little bit. With the newest Eevee, this looks really nice in Eevee. It's awesome. I'm going to give it a skin tone that I'm happy with. So I'm just going to use the base color for that. And I find that the base color is just not enough to get an impression of the sort of nooks and crannies. So what I'm going to do is enhance this base material using an ambient occlusion node. But before I do that, let's go ahead and create a couple of lights. Mind you, you can also use a HDRI if you like for this setup. I think I've got one in this scene already, but you don't necessarily need one. So let's go ahead and create two lights. We're going to create one on the left and one on the right side of my character. Now these can be colored lights as you see here. I'm going to add a little bit of a pinkish or warm hue on the left side, and then I'm going to create a cooler one on the right side. Classic sort of 3-point lighting principles, nothing fancy here. Place the light at an angle that you find appealing. That gives you a nice little bit of a rim light that you can sort of see where the light is sort of bouncing off the edge of the character and sort of gives you an impression of where certain details can be improved or smoothed out or enhanced. The reason I'm using different colored lights, by the way, rather than just two white lights, is basically because it also gives me an impression of how the skin tone is going to sit within varied lighting scenarios. I just find that to be kind of fun. It also just looks cool. So go ahead and just have fun with it. But you don't want to go overboard with the different lights. Stick to three at most. So you'd have a fill light at the front, you'd have your two lights at the side, each of varying colors, and that will give you a good impression of how the material and how the face is looking overall in this lighting scenario. Now you can see here the actual skin tone's looking kind of flat. We can't really do much about that at this point unless we wanted to texture it. So what I'm going to do is create a geometry node. Sorry, not a geometry node, an ambient occlusion node. And we're going to use that ambient occlusion data as a mix factor. So I'm going to create a mix node. So make sure it's a mixed color node, not just a mixed node. So mixed color node. And we're going to pump in the AO into the factor, and then the result will go into the base color of our principled shader. So you can go with whatever color you want for this. So in this case, I had black and white to begin with. Now I'm going to add a mix node in between the ambient occlusion and the mix node, and then just sort of scale the ramp to get enough sort of shadowing around the eyelids and within the lips and stuff like that. Once you've done that, you can get a good idea of how the sort of creases of your face are looking inside of a rendered scenario. Once you've done that, then go ahead and change the colors of your mix node. So a darker color for your creases and bring back your skin tone color for the rest of the face. Once we have that, we can see there are a few minor issues with the character design as it stands. So obviously we haven't done the ears yet, but there are some small issues that we can resolve with some basic sculpting. So for instance, you can see there's a little bit of unevenness in the ambient occlusion around the eyelids. So I want to fix that up a little bit and just soften out those details and get a more even result overall. So using probably a smooth brush tool and just using the crease tool, we can sort of fix that up a little bit. And the same can apply to whatever you're creating. So whatever you think looks good and what looks bad, go ahead and just refine it a little bit further before you move on, if you think it is at all necessary. Okay, so we've got the eyes, the mouth, and the nose done. We've got the overall structure of the face done. Let's go ahead and do the ears. They are simpler than you think in some ways, and in some ways they can be a bit complicated. So what I recommend is that you just have some reference on hand. So go ahead and just find an ear reference, one that you like, I guess you can say. Ears are different from person to person, but the overall structure is relatively the same. But if you have a certain shape in mind, I guess you want to follow those that you can find online. So let's go ahead and get started on those ears. And to get started on those, I'm going to use a few other tools to help me get there a little bit easier, namely using masks and using something called the pose tool. So the pose tool basically just emulates an armature bone temporarily to help you move things along a pivot according to the radius of the brush, with the center of the brush being the pivot point. Now, this is great for doing broad stroke poses and realigning certain parts of the body, but you can see here that sometimes it does tend to pull away parts of the mesh that you don't really want to move. To solve this, we're going to use a mask. So to get started using the mask, select the mask tool and then brush over the area of the ear that you want to edit, both the front and the back. And once you've done that, go ahead and invert what you've brushed in. That will effectively only make the ear editable in sculpt mode. So as you can see here, we're getting a much more consistent result using the pose tool to sort of line up the ear. And we can move that around as we see fit, but it won't affect the rest of the face. Once you're happy with your edit, go ahead and remove that mask and then start to smooth out any jagged areas that you think are problem points. So just like anything else when sculpting the face, we're going to start off with a blocking pass. So for this, I'm just going to be using the clay strips tool to sort of sketch out the structure of the ear, particularly the little folds and stuff like that, and the pattern that you get with an ear. Make sure you have a reference on hand. I just looked up a Google image and that's good enough. Ear structures are generally pretty consistent between people, apart from overall shape and perhaps lobes, how big they are, that sort of thing. So again, just starting with the broad strokes. So the patterns that you see here, yeah, you can follow along with this video or use a reference on hand to sort of block out your own pattern. So what I have here is sort of like a S-bend, so to speak. I block out the area where the ear hole is, and then just start to cut away certain structures where I deem fit. Ears also tend to have a bit of a forked structure at the top of the ear, so you'll see me block that out now as well. Also, take note of the render preview as I'm doing this. I'm basically doing this with full render preview turned on using Eevee. And you can see here that the ambient occlusion is actually kind of working to our favor here in sort of highlighting where things are a little bit too deep or a little bit too shallow. So you may have to go through a series of additive sculpts and then smoothing it, bring it back down a little bit, and then sort of refining from there. Very similar to the rest of the face. So from there on in, I just start to use tools such as the pinch brush or the crease brush to sort of line out the little creases and little folds that give an ear its character. Now, again, if you don't really need to have a stylized ear such as this, just go ahead and use more geometric shapes, go with a more basic approach, whatever suits your character. This is not absolutely necessary to get a successful character. You don't need to have a realistic ear. But it is worth mentioning if you do want to go down this route, as long as you have a clear reference and you follow the general structures of the ear, it's relatively fast to block out a pretty realistic ear, all things considered, in my opinion. The more common mistakes when it comes to sculpting ears is mostly to do with the position of the ear and the nature in which the ear is attached to the skull. So if your ear is sort of sitting a bit further away from the skull than what is natural, it starts to look a little bit cartoony, a little bit more Shrek-like. Also, the position of the ear relative to the eye and the mouth also will determine how natural the ear position sits within the character design. Now, another thing to be mindful of is that the back of the ear actually has volume as well. So make sure you don't ignore that. Ears don't connect to the head like a tube. They have creases and folds just like anything else when it comes to the body. And again, if you need to refine, don't be afraid to use those masks to move those ears around, place them a little bit closer to the skull, a little bit further away from the skull to get that proportion feeling right. So for me, I felt like the ears were a little bit too further away from the skull, so I brought them a little bit closer and a little bit forward in the face. Furthermore, the way that the ear blends into the jawline is also really important. So you want to have this sort of nice, I guess you can say, connection point, so to speak, where the base of the ear sits almost flush with the back of the jawline. Also, take note that the sides of the face tend to be relatively flatter than the rest of the skull. So, having a bit of a planar effect along the side of the face will help to sort of settle that ear into the overall structure of your character's design. And finally, cheekbones are really important, especially if you're going for a more angular approach. So make sure you bring that volume back into the head, into the skull, and also that connection point from the cheek up to the ear. Make sure that's well defined and has enough volume there as well. Okay, so just a few more touch ups along the way. Just going to refine a few little crease points, maybe, or refine a bit of the eyelids. And we're pretty much done with the overall shape of the skull, overall shape of the face. And yeah, minor adjustments as needed. So also just be mindful that these minor adjustments can change a character quite drastically, especially when it comes to making a character feel youthful or more aged. So you don't want to go too crazy with this stuff, especially if you're going for a more stylized approach. Okay, now just for the sake of reference for me, I'm going to go ahead and paint in a pupil for this character. And I'm going to be using vertex paints to do this. Now, what I need to do is select my eye, increase the subdivisions of this using the subdivision modifier, and then apply that subdivision modifier once I've got enough geometry to work with. Now, I will admit that this is just one method of many different kinds of methods to get some visualizations for the eyes. So I just find this one to be applicable for this particular sculpt, and I think it's actually quite a fun way of doing it as well because it's quite adaptable. Now switch back into sculpt mode with the eye selected, and we're going to go back to material preview in the viewport so we can see what we're doing when we're coloring in these eyes. So the first thing we're going to do is look for the paint tool. So what this will allow us to do is basically color in the vertices of the mesh directly without needing a texture. So let's just start off by coloring in the whites of the eye completely. And as you can see, nothing's happening in the render viewport, by the way. That's normal. Don't freak out. Now, let's go ahead and select a black brush and then paint in the pupils. Now, you can adjust the brush to be a little bit sharper for this to get a sharper pupil, but be mindful, this is just a temporary thing before we actually go ahead and do the proper texturing for the eye. So it's just purely for visualization's sake. So yeah, go ahead and adjust the brush as you see fit, and then just paint in that pupil to your liking. Now, I wouldn't bother going ahead and doing all the colors and the irises and all that sort of shit. Don't worry about that. Just focus on the pupil for the time being. We just want to make sure that our character isn't going to look cross-eyed or something like that. So one thing to note is that on the right side, we can actually see the pupils using the material preview, but on the left side, using the render preview, we can't see shit. Now, the reason for that is because we need to actually assign these vertex colors to a material. So that's done using the material editor. So with the eye selected, go ahead and make a brand new material. Then switch over to the vertex data panel and open up the color attributes panel. And you'll see this attribute called color that was automatically created when we started doing the vertex painting. So what we're going to do is in the material editor, we're going to create a color attribute node. And this will allow us to take that color attribute and plug it into our color input of our principled shader. So go ahead and create that color attribute node, and then you'll see the color attribute inside that panel, and then take the color output, plug it into the color input of your principled shader, and now you'll be able to see the pupils in the render preview as well as in your standard viewport. The nice thing about this is, of course, you can edit this at any time. So you can erase the pupils, make brand new ones, change the color, do whatever you want. And it's quite easy, it's quite performant, and it doesn't require you to do any UV unwrapping, doesn't require you to do any sculpting, it doesn't require you to create any new geometry. So that's why I went down with this method. So as you can see here, I decided, let's go ahead and refine that pupil. I redrew it, and then I'm happy with the final result. Okay, so now we have the overall face done. Let's go ahead and block out the hair. Now, this can be done at any given level. So you can either have a very generalized design just to help you get along to the next stage of the sculpting phase, or you can go down the full detailed route and have something that is fully detailed with every strand, all that sort of good stuff. Now, for me, I'm going to keep it simple. I don't need that right now, and I feel that I'd just be wasting my time if I went down that route anyway, because I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to go down a particle hair system or a more sort of cartoony physical hair system. So let's see. But all I will say is that keep it simple for this video. I guess you'd say, if you're doing this for the first time, just keep it simple. Make it easier for yourself. Don't go too crazy. Also, if you go down the too much detail route, you may end up looking at your hair and thinking it looks really busy, when in actual fact you just added detail where it wasn't necessary. So keep it to those primary shapes for now, and your life will be a little bit easier. And of course, if you're doing this for a client, then of course you'll probably need to add more detail and make sure it is applicable for the character. So again, it's really dependent on the design, who you're doing it for, and how much time you have to do it. All right, so let's jump into those details right now. Now, of course, if you were to go give this to a client and they demanded more resolution, more detail, then you go ahead and do that. But for personal purposes, I don't think it's absolutely necessary to go down the insanely detailed route when it comes to sculpting out the hair. So to start off, I'm going to start with the eyebrows, and I'm going to use a combination of standard modeling and sculpting. So for the eyebrows, I don't think I need to sculpt out anything. So I'm just going to go ahead and extrude out the shape of the eyebrows with a standard tool set in edit mode. But even at this stage, feel free to add a material to this that matches the hair color of your character. So in this case, my character's hair is black, so that's pretty easy for me. I'm not going to bother doing anything else, so go ahead and do that. It's worth noting, by the way, that if your character does have multicolored hair, such as an ombre, where it fades from one color to the other, you can actually go ahead and color that in using the vertex painting tool that we talked about moments ago with the eye, and just apply that for the hair. So that's pretty cool. All right, going back to the eyebrow here, sticking with a single plane, I'm going to go ahead and extrude out the shape of the eyebrow. I'm not going to bother about trying to line it up with the face, at least not on the skin itself, because I'm going to use a shrink wrap modifier to do that for me. The shrink wrap modifier basically just sticks that mesh onto the surface of any given selected object. So in this case, I'm selecting the sculpt, and then I'm going to offset that slightly using whatever values I see fit. So just use the standard settings for the most part. I tried tinkering around with it a little bit to get a better result, but didn't quite work out. So just use the standard preset. Once we're happy with the way the eyebrow is looking, we can go ahead and add a little bit of thickness to that geometry using a solidify modifier. Feel free to add a subdivision modifier as well to smooth out that detail. So once you've got that ready to roll, let's go ahead and create a solidify modifier and just adjust those values to match the scale of your character. Again, you may need to add or remove geometry as you see fit, but because I'm going with a more sharper look for the eyebrows, I decided to add a few more subdivisions to that eyebrow to get the way I want it to look. Okay, so let's add a few eyelashes or a very simple eyelash design to the face. So again, we're going to use a very simple method for this. We're just going to create a plane and then a series of extrusions along one edge to get the shape we need, following along with the eyelid. Okay, so a neat trick you can use to make this job a little bit easier is to use vertex extrusions in combination with face snapping. So go ahead and enable face snapping before we move on. You may need to enable align rotation to target as well to make it work a little bit better. And make sure the target selection only includes non-edited objects. Okay, select only one of those verts and then start extruding along the edge of the eyelid. Doesn't matter how many of those you do, just go ahead and make enough to maintain the structure of the eyelash that you're creating. Once you've done that, go ahead and delete that single face you see on your screen. So now all you should have is a single edge to work with. Disable the face snapping at this point. Switch into edge selection, then go ahead and select the whole thing and then push E to extrude. And now you have the perfect basis for a nicely designed eyelash. Apply all your transforms and then add a mirror modifier. Add a new material to represent the blackness of your eyelashes. If you need to invert your normals, go ahead and push Shift N to normalize your normals, so to speak, and then start to edit those edges. So you can edge slide them by double tapping G, or you can just move them around as you see fit. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple here. I'm going to add another edge loop in the middle to sort of give it a little bit of a flow, so to speak. And then that's pretty much it for the time being. I'm not going to go too crazy with this. I'm not going to split it up or try and make individual lashes. That's just silly. So this is just enough that I need for now. Okay, so with the eyelashes done, we can now move on to blocking out the hair. Now, this is going to be a combination of sculpting and straight up modeling. So for the fringe, I'm just going to use a sphere to block out the fringe or the bangs, if you want to call it that. I'm going to start off by centering the 3D cursor to the top of the skull and center it along X on 0. And that just means that when I create a sphere, it's going to be created at that point in the 3D space. For this particular design, I'm just going to use a straight up UV sphere to get started. For your character's hair, it might be different. You might not even need to do this. You may even want to just go straight into sculpting out the body of the hair. Anyway, create that sphere and then scale it down as you see fit. I'm going to have it sort of match the overall volume of the fringe and then apply the scale. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and select the faces that I don't need for the fringe. So go ahead and delete anything you don't need. So in this case, I don't need the bottom of the sphere. I'm going to cut those away. I'm then going to go ahead and add a material for this hair. So again, black hair, pretty simple material. Not going to bother about doing anything fancy right now. So just a basic black material. And now I'm going to go ahead and further edit the position of the hair and the scale before I start going down a more detailed route. When I'm happy, I'm going to go into edit mode and have edge selection turned on. And then I'm going to select the edges that I want to split. And that will give me the bangs that I want. And with that done, I push V and then I can sort of separate that edge selection into two parts. And that effectively splits the mesh into different pieces, so to speak. So that gives me a very cheap way to create bangs. You can also add new edges using the knife tool and then split those if you want to. And you can have a little bit more detail if you want. Also, make sure you're not mirroring the geometry in this case because we want to have that asymmetry in the hair. We don't want to have it looking symmetrical at this stage. Well, ever really. So just split the edges in parts that you think look natural. Now, again, this is particular to my character design. So if you don't have this, then it's not applicable to you, but you may be able to find a different solution for your needs using these basic editing tools. Okay, I'm going to speed this up just a smidge because it's pretty repetitive at this point. So all I would say is go ahead and keep dividing as you see fit. And then you can use soft select to sort of move general parts of the hair around. And if you want to have a little bit of sharpness, feel free to jump back into object mode and then set the hair to auto smooth at a certain angle. So you can see here that I've added a little bit of a crest on the hairlines here and they look a bit soft. So what I'm going to do is just um, scale these along the normals. That's Alt S to scale. I'm going to go ahead and use soft select to bring down the fringe around the ear. I'm also going to use soft select to add a little bit more unevenness along the fringe. So I don't want the hairline to sit at the same level. So I'm just going to give some very subtle changes there. Now to add the sharpness you see there in the render, I selected the object in object mode and then right clicked and added auto smooth at a certain angle. In this case, it was around 45 degrees or 60 degrees, and that will automatically sharpen up those edges along that edge if it's at a certain angle. Okay, so with the fringe done, I'm going to go ahead and now sculpt out the body of the hair at the back. Again, I'm just going to use a sphere for this, and then I'm going to use din topo or dynamic topology to sculpt out the volume of the hair. Now you can use any shape you want to start this blocking process. I'm using an icosphere in this case. You can use a cube, you can use a UV sphere, it doesn't really matter. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use an icosphere. So I'm just going to place that sphere at a point that I'm happy with. I'm going to add that material back in, and then I'm going to jump into sculpt mode, turn on dynamic topology, and then start to block out the volume of the hair according to my sketch. So you will see that some tools don't actually work with dynamic topology, only some do. So in this case, I'm going to use the snake hook tool to add new geometry with dynamic topology turned on to push out some extra geometry that will allow me to build out that volume. So it's pretty quick when you're doing it this way. You can be very loose, very fast with this. So don't be too precious with the way that it's creating that geometry. If it's looking a little bit too jaggedy, again, do a remesh pass using the remesh modifier, or you just use the remesh tool inside of sculpt mode. Once you have enough geometry to play with, you can then jump back into using the elastic deform brush or the pull brush or anything like that to further refine the hair. So make sure that you're looking at it at every angle as well. Make sure that you have volume that looks kind of right from the back, the front, and the sides. Don't be worried about adding fancy strands or anything like that at this stage, unless you have to do that for a client and have to have that detail in there. At this stage, if you're doing it for a personal project, this should be enough to move on to later down the track. Now, just again, keep it very loose at this stage, and it will give you just a good idea of whether or not the volumes are working at all to begin with. Now, again, it's completely up to you how far you want to take this process. For me, I like to keep it pretty loose because I know that I'm going to have to redo it anyway in the future. And I'm not sure yet whether or not I'm going to go down a particle hair route or a more cartoony physical hair route with this design. So we'll see how we go in the later videos. But by having this blockout pass, it allows you to have at least some sort of 3D reference to build out those shapes in the future. And then finally, just for a little bit of fun, I'm going to use the clay strips tool to evoke the sense of flow for the hair. And I'm also going to use the snake hook tool to basically add a little bit of hair around the ear. That's pretty much it. I'm not going to go too far with this. And at this stage, I'm pretty much happy to call it for now. I'm happy with the detail that I have in the face. I'm happy with the detail I have in the hair. It will give me enough to work from in the future. And I think that I've managed to capture the characteristics from my lineup sketch, my model sheet into 3D. If I'm happy with that, I'm happy now to move on to the body. So let's go ahead and check out a final render of the sculpt in its current form. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you've had fun. And at 45 minutes long, it is no slouch. There's tons of information there, tons of stuff to take in, and of course, plenty more to learn. So if you found this video useful, and if you have created a sculpt, please let me know. Chuck it up on Instagram, give me a tag, and just let me know how you went with it. And I'd love to see what you've made as well. So I would really appreciate that. If you have any suggestions in the comments, please let me know, because I can apply that to the next video, which is going to be all about sculpting the body. And there's tons of stuff to talk about there as well. All right, so that's it. If you want to support the channel, of course, Patreon, YouTube memberships, all that sort of good stuff. And if you have any questions, feel free to add a comment down below or join the Discord channel through Patreon for the time being. All right, so with that being said, catchers, have fun, and see you later. See ya.